Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Todd Thomas, and I am joining Amanda Kristal, Scott Morissette, and Chad Gruhl, who are also members of Amanda's dissertation committee for her dissertation defense. Very quickly, if you're not quite sure how these operate, let me give you a quick overview of how this will go. In just a moment, I will turn it over to Amanda, who has been asked to put together a presentation that represents the key ideas and the key findings of her dissertation. She will share that. She will share that information with us. After which, we will have an opportunity for questions. The committee will ask questions of Amanda first, and you are invited to ask questions in the chat. I will be, as the chair of the committee, I will be looking at the questions, paying attention to time. So if you ask a question and it's not asked, please forgive me ahead of time, because we'll use a limited amount of time for this. At which point this presentation then will be over. Once the presentation is over, I and my committee colleagues will meet separately to discuss any feedback that we have for Amanda. She will come back to that meeting. We will talk to her about the success of her dissertation, and then we will send an email out to everyone who attended to let you know how everything wrapped up. So again, thank you for joining us. And there may be little beeps along the way here for a few minutes as more people join us in this conversation. But for now, enjoy. And I am going to turn it over to Amanda. Amanda, it is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And all right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss building the family legacy, an exemplar multiple case study approach to understanding the impact of transgenerational succession has on family-owned business culture. I would like to thank my dissertation committee members of Dr. Thomas, Dr. Gruhl, and Dr. Morissette for the time they've spent with me throughout this journey. We'll go ahead and dive right in. Today we'll be discussing the following topics. First, we'll get into an introduction, followed by the statement of the problem. We will touch on the conceptual framework of the study, and then get into the purpose statement and the significance of the study. We'll follow with some research questions that were posed during the study, and then get into the high-level literature review, and then get into the methodology. Finally, getting to the findings and results of the study, as well as the limitations, implications for practice, and then recommendations for future research. And then at that point, we'll be open for a discussion. So family-owned businesses are very influential in communities, and family businesses are the ones that support the youth baseball programs and local community events or charity auctions. That they're the businesses that everyone turns to when looking in local communities for support and donations. It's these families that become a huge part of the communities and that they are involved in. To put in perspective of how succession impacts family-owned businesses, in a community of roughly 100 family-owned businesses, only 3 of them will continue into the next generation. That is not very many. If you think of your local businesses, you might be able to think of a few that off the top of your head, but I'm sure that there aren't very many that you know of that have made it to 2nd and or 3rd generation. When researching transgenerational succession, which describes the type of succession that is the focus of this study, which transgenerational succession will be defined later, but it essentially is the passing down of family-owned businesses from parents to child or grandparent to grandchild, but essentially keeping the ownership of the business in the family and passing it down to the next generation. It was evident in the research that the succession process itself impacted the business's ability to continue to the next generation. And one of the key barriers that stood out when implementing strategic organizational change Initiatives was the concept of culture clash as a reason for failed transition in organizations. This started that deeper dive into wondering why and how this impacts family-owned businesses. If only 3 family-owned businesses will make it to the next generation, part of that reason could be culture clash. What can we do to help solve that problem? Which then leads us to the problem statement that is addressed in this study. In this diagram, we see on the screen, it represents the average business life cycle. The business is a startup, begins to grow, becomes sustainable, and eventually begins to decline a bit. And here's where the opportunity presents itself. There's the option to extend the life cycle of the business or for the business to continue to decline and eventually decay. Regardless of which road is chosen, succession planning of some type is an inevitable event. Keep in mind, we are focusing on family-owned businesses, so an owner has a few options. They can sell the business off to a third party, they can liquidate the business and all of its assets and just walk away, or if a successor is in place, they can extend the life cycle of the family business through transgenerational succession and let the next generation take over the business. For the purpose of hypotheticals and being relevant to the study, let's say the founder decides to go with transgenerational succession. Studies have found that succession leadership changes and organizational culture changes are intertwined. I believe most of us have had a time in our careers that we've got a new boss, or maybe we feel like we're walking on eggshells a bit. So you've already felt this in your own careers, but I want to understand what that impact felt like for family-owned businesses. And the research merging succession planning and its impact on family-owned business organizational culture is minimal. For the statement of the problem, fills a gap found between succession planning and family-owned business culture. The problem to be addressed within the study is the impact that transgenerational succession has on the cultures of family-owned businesses. The conceptual framework for the study is broken into 2 parts of literature that we're merging together, the culture assessment and the succession timeline. The succession timeline for the study is based on the timeline from Dr. Bagby, showing the succession timeline of family-owned businesses. There's a time leading up to the succession event, maybe the initial discussions or someone voicing their interest in taking over ownership of the business, and the process begins. Then there's a succession event. This is the actual handoff or transition of the business. Then lastly, there's the succession consequences. This is when the transferring of capital or the evaluation of feedback from staff occurs. When looking at the timeline, it was evident that this exemplary study needed to start from the point of impact and let others build on the timeline. The succession event itself was the point of impact, and it was this transition period that was called into question to assess the impact that the succession event had on organization's culture. The culture assessment framework for this study is the 5 windows framework, created by Dr. Levin in 2000. It is his framework that looked beneath the surface of the organizational culture assessment tools and focused on the behaviors and perceptions of the culture. This assessment is broken down into 5 windows, which are leadership, norms and practices, stories and legends, traditions and rituals, as well as symbols. Each of these culture impacts play their own role in an organization, and it was the deeper understanding of the culture that was chosen for this framework for the study. So the purpose statement, the purpose of the study is to explore the impact that transgenerational succession has on organizational culture behaviors and perceptions of family-owned businesses. This would be completed by evaluating the culture barriers during transgenerational succession and the understanding that the impact of each of these 5 windows during that transgenerational succession event. The goal of the study was to investigate the culture behaviors and perceptions found during transgenerational succession event and define the culture behaviors and perceptions. The significance of the study is to provide insight and explore how organizational culture perceptions and behaviors during the transgenerational succession impact organizational culture in a family-owned business. To provide resource creation was the first one. And provide resource creation on the perception that behaviors and trends displayed during the transition period and their effects on the culture. To increase visibility and understanding was the second. The impact that transgenerational succession has on the organizational culture needs to be visible to the greater academic community. And then lastly is to continue to contribute the literature to the larger body of research to close the gap in family-owned business succession and the culture of transgenerational succession. There are three primary research questions of this study, and the first is, how does transgenerational succession impact organizational culture? The second is, how does the 5 windows framework emerge to be relevant during transgenerational succession? The sub-questions of this question focused on the evaluation of the role and impact of each of the 5 windows. So each of the 5 windows can be seen on the screen, and there are 2 research questions related to that, one focusing on role, the second focusing on impact. And lastly, we wanted to understand, how do behaviors and perceptions impact transgenerational succession from both the perspective of the leadership as well as the employees. Getting into the literature review, this is a high-level overview of what literature was used for this study. But this section was broken into 3 main sections. The first is understanding family-owned businesses. The second is follows is the family-owned business succession, and lastly is family-owned business culture. The definition used for this study of family-owned business is defined as an organization where the remaining significant company shareholders and/or members of the founding family remain in senior management or hold a seat on the board of directors. The organization is also owned and managed by individuals with family relations. There is a possible opportunity for family members to be groomed or considered and for eventual leadership here. So the characteristics of a family-owned business that were found in research was that a family-owned business is a humanistic workplace, where the human beings in the organization are viewed as the largest asset. There was also research supporting that family-owned businesses have a personal environment and feel as though they are part of the family, and they view the leadership in the business as mentors. These characteristics are very important because they are the key differentiators between family-owned businesses and non-family-owned businesses. The second set of research, a majority of the research for family-owned businesses, is practitioner-based. The practical knowledge from people who have experienced firsthand experience in family-owned business was the bulk of the literature rather than research-based literature. There is a demand on the practitioner side for the knowledge of family-owned businesses, although the immaturity and significant research gaps in the field create the necessity for research-based literature. Next, we're going to get into succession. Succession is the secondary bulk of the literature review of this study. Succession is defined as a deliberate and systemic effort by an organization to ensure that leadership continuity in key positions. We also define succession planning, which is the process of leadership transition between generations within a family enterprise. Succession is as important as it is a critical event in the transition of a family-owned business. It is the process of transferring the emotions, the values, and the behaviors, along with the balancing of behaviors and perceptions of anyone who is impacted by these businesses. Specifically in the study, we discussed transgenerational succession, which is defined as the passing down the business to the next generation of family members. This is one of the most important transition events in the life cycle of a family-owned business, as this enables the business to grow and continue to create generational wealth for the family. The bulk of research of succession revolves around the planning protocols and the continuity, the leadership transitions, and the successor abilities along with the founder characteristics. When trying to understand the cultural aspects of succession, the focus is on the power transfer and the conflict between generations, as well as a large section focusing on why succession fails. Succession failure was a key section of succession research, and one of the key barriers is the lack of a successor. In today's day and age, the family structure has changed from what has been common in the past, and the individualism in society plays a role as a factor for successors in family-owned businesses. As part of succession failure, a problematic dynamic that can be felt by the incumbent or the individual leaving the organization is the fear of loss of control. The preferential treatment of the next generation becomes apparent, and the overall loss of social status can create difficulty for the incumbent. Change is not always simple, and change is not easy, and the incumbent's identity has been linked to this family-owned business. This could create potential issues in the commercial sustainability throughout the succession process. In the last section is the family-owned business culture. It was defined in the study as the knowledge, experience, beliefs, values, and attitudes acquired by an organization based on the founding family's characteristics over the generations. In research, the culture of family-owned business is largely based on the beliefs, the values, the goals, all rooted within the family and the history, as well as their current social relationships. However, there is a gap in research regarding the transmission of culture through generations. This is the created additional value-added opportunities for studies like these. Next, we'll jump into the methodology of the study. This is a mixed method study where all the participants are Michigan-based automotive dealers that have continued to operate after completing transgenerational succession. The qualitative portion is based on the 5 windows framework and uses interviews and observations from both the incumbent and the successor, and the responses are then coded for keyword trends. The quantitative portion is an anonymous survey that was created and influenced by the 5 windows framework culture assessment tool to survey the employees and management that were impacted by the transgenerational succession event to understand their perceptions of the culture during the transgenerational succession event. The diagram on the screen displays how each of the individual final case study reports will contain the observations and interviews and the survey data that will lead into a larger findings report. The quantitative survey was open to 3 days prior to the interview date. The data collected for each survey question was based on an employee and manager responses to a Likert scale survey. The survey data was collected anonymously and went into a single database to determine statistical significance and analyze key factors to describe the culture. An ANOVA test, t-test, and regression test was run on all of the survey data. The qualitative portion of the study was combined of interviews of the incumbent and successor, which were individual one-on-one interviews, as well as open-ended optional survey responses, as well as any observations that I had during my time during the interviews. The data was then coded and analyzed for key factors and trends to describe the impact transgenerational succession has on family-owned business culture. Diving into our findings, we'll start with the qualitative findings. In the end, we had 3 dealerships participate in the study. This led to a total of 6 interviews, 3 with the incumbent and 3 with the successor. The graph on the screen represents the key words found in each set of the interviews describing the culture. The top being the incumbent's words used to describe the culture, the bottom being the successor's words keywords used to describe the culture. The overlapping keywords from the interviews were car, manager, community, customer, and employee. In further analysis, I found that although some of these words, such as car, when speaking about a dealership, seemed to be common words, it was not so much the word itself as the context of the word. For example, an incumbent may use the word car just as a unit of inventory in a micro perspective of the day-to-day operations, and the successor sees the car not just as a unit of inventory, but a symbol of how they treat their customers in a macro perspective and ensuring the car is the right fit for the right customer. Each of these overlapping words held their own perspective between the incumbent and the successor that will be discussed in greater detail within the results. The quantitative portion of the study had a total of 17 employee and manager responses. We did reject the null of the hypothesis for the research question 2.1 and 2.2 regarding the difference between the responses of the survey questions that were discussing the different characteristics for 2 of the 5 windows, and accepted the null hypothesis that the transgenerational succession did not indicate statistical significance in the study and no impact occurred on organization characteristics of the 5 windows, which will be discussed in greater detail within our results section. Lastly, for the quantitative findings, a regression analysis was completed to determine if there was a significance in the responses between employees and managers of the survey questions. However, the regression analysis showed the study did not prove to be statistically significant in the difference between employees and manager responses in the survey. Getting into the overall results, each of the 5 windows displayed its own value in understanding the depth of the impact on the culture from the transgenerational succession event. In the study, there was no significant impact on the culture as the successors in the study intended to continue the culture that was already established within the organization. The family values, morals, and ethics were evident across multiple of the 5 windows, displaying the core of the family-owned business organizational culture. There is a source of family pride between generations, displayed through symbols, stories, and the legends that assisted in maintaining the organization's culture through this transition period. These findings provided additional insights into the family-owned business organizational culture and the impact that transgenerational succession has on family-owned businesses. Breaking down the results into each of the 5 windows, the leadership key pieces that were pulled were that the core values, morals, ethics were groomed between generations and stayed consistent in the leadership of the organization's culture. The priorities of both generations were good business practices and focused on the business survival. For the norms and practices, managers were key for the successor and incumbent to maintain those norms and practices through that transition event. They were not although the norms and practices were not impacted by the transgenerational succession event. As for stories and legends, coming together to overcome was a key trend that was throughout the interviews of both the incumbent and the successor. And when telling stories about heroes, the heroes were seen as people who were respected due to great work ethics and customer service. The stories varied based on the next generation's goals for the organizations. So some stories did make it through the transgenerational succession event, but whether their use in certain situations varied based on the goal of the next successor or of what was going on in the business at that time. For traditions and rituals, there is a ritual in the automotive industry that is called cutting the tie when you sell a first car. Although it's not as common anymore due to the relaxed retire in dealerships, it was traditions like these or Christmas parties or team meetings that were key to maintaining the culture through this transgenerational succession event. And successors maintained some of these traditions and rituals to maintain the culture, but the biggest thing was that they ensured that the same message was conveyed through that transgenerational succession event. For symbols, there were no new symbols that were added, but there was an emphasis on the impact of the core symbols of the organization's culture, whether that be their name, their logo, a sign that was in the break room. It was those symbols that had an extra emphasis during the transition event to ensure that the culture maintained the same. And successors found value, especially in slogans and facilities, as symbols of their culture. This also led to ensuring that the expectations and the reputation of their family-owned business was maintained through and after that transgenerational succession event. Some limitations for this study was that the study focused on new car automotive dealers that are family-owned dealerships that have completed transgenerational succession within the last completed transgenerational succession, and there's less than 5 dealerships that they own. There are 616 new car dealerships but the criteria brought it down to roughly 12 that possibly met the criteria when discussed with the president of the Michigan Dealer Association. Although I did vet the entire list of 116 new car dealerships and checked the websites to confirm if they were eligible, after determining if they might be eligible, I reached out to dealerships to confirm their history. This is where response rates from the dealerships were incredibly low. There were numerous attempts made through calling, emails, visits, to see if I could confirm the history of the size of the dealer. However, the population for the study was very low. An additional limit that the dealerships had was that it still had to be owned and operated as a family-owned dealership, which created a limit as the pandemic did impact family-owned businesses, and some of the well-known family-owned dealerships were purchased by larger dealer groups in the last few years. Which leads to the next limitation. As mentioned earlier, the current economy did impact family-owned businesses, and large dealer groups were buying smaller family-owned business dealerships. But there was also an impact to the family-owned business dealerships as the inventory from manufacturers impacted their ability to stay in business. And lastly, the fact that the business had to have completed transgenerational succession, as some dealerships have already sold out to dealer groups, were in the process of transitioning, or did not plan to transition in the near future, or were not transitioning at all. So those are some of the limitations for the study. Implications for practice. Each of the 5 windows did play a role, and the windows represented the different culture aspects. Each plays back to the family perspective of the family-owned businesses that have completed transgenerational succession. Nothing significant changed in the culture, but they all gave credit to the family history and the culture that was already in the family-owned business and had intentions to continue to grow the culture in the next generation. This is a key learning for other businesses looking to complete this transition, to understand that continuing the culture will help navigate that transition of succession in the future. So one of the key implications for practice was that maintaining the culture through morals and ethics of the culture were key concepts discussed in the interviews, that displaying the core values of the family-owned business stayed the same, and the impact in the culture was not significant. These observations of these morals and ethics to maintain the culture were viewed to be the founding family's values. So the family's values were then displayed in the business and vice versa. The demeanor and body language regarding the business between the incumbent and successor were very similar. How they talk, how they would speak, how they would act when certain business conversations was very similar, and that could have assisted in maintaining the culture in the leadership. The context of the words could differ based on the generational leadership's goals. However, a lot of the same words were used when describing pieces of their culture. The second was employee awareness. Employees are aware of the culture changes, as well as the potential tension between incumbent and successor. It was expressed that communication from leadership created less tension in the culture, and it was through these open-ended surveys that the employees expressed that they saw it, they understood it, but it was that communication from the leadership that maybe helped ease that transition. But understanding that employees are aware is something for future businesses to be aware of. And then the successor's ability to maintain core values, culture norms, and provided additional support throughout that succession event. So maintaining some of their cores really made a difference for the employees through the transition. It is the successor's responsibility to maintain the culture. It is the employees and managers that relied on the successors for indications of the organization's culture would be maintained. The employees did indicate that they looked to the successor for the next moves or next steps, and the successor's ability to communicate that the culture would be maintained did support the staff. Lessons learned and observations from the incumbent did help the successor maintain the culture as they grew up in that culture, and they were able to kind of keep some of the same values and morals that their father had or the incumbent had, so that the successor was able to continue off of some of the observations they grew up learning. Lastly is that family decisions. The founding family was at the core of the decision making for the family-owned business. So they were the ones that were always making all of the decisions, and they were focusing on what was good for the founding family, along with understanding that their name and reputation were significant factors in for both the incumbent and successor. And that was keeping current that their name and reputation stayed the same as well as in the future. The successor did discuss that the role that the incumbent played in overall personal growth and their leadership abilities, because they learned to be a leader from the incumbent or their father. But lastly, it was that the family was extremely important to them. Every single successor and incumbent did express that family was very important and that they saw their staff as well to be their family. So sometimes they were making decisions not only based on what was good for their core family, but for what was good for their work family and what was good for everybody at large. And lastly, we have the recommendations for future research. First, there's that the study could go over multiple years and multiple organizations. The study could be extended by assessing the culture before, during, and after transgenerational succession event. And then maybe by comparing that to multiple different organizations going through the same transition during the same time period, you could get a deeper understanding of what that succession would look like. Interviewing employees would provide a greater understanding of the survey responses, or forego the surveys altogether and only interview employees. I would say that there were a couple survey questions that we very much could have had a greater understanding if we were able to speak with them. However, having that survey first to find those areas to see where the survey responses maybe differed would provide the first step to then interviewing the employees as well. Next is to expand to different industries and communities, working in industries such as trades, independent retailers, expanding the communities to other communities or other groups that go through transgenerational succession, whether that be keeping in trades with multiple different trades groups that are the same, or possibly staying in one community that happens to have multiple family-owned businesses that have continued through multiple generations, and seeing the difference of how their responses differ between a area that has multiple businesses that have gone to generations versus one that maybe has not. And then lastly is to expand to a nationwide population. If this study could have been a larger population and increased the number of eligible participants, I believe that some of our results may have differed than what we had, just because we didn't have the numbers that we were hoping, and that if we were to be able to expand to a nationwide population, we could have seen a larger impact of what the culture, how culture and succession impact one another. And I would like to thank everyone for attending and open the floor to questions.
All right, thank you, Amanda. And as I said, the first set of questions would come from the committee. And Dr. Rule, it looks like, and so Tama, I will come to you, but we're going to spend some time with the committee first. So Dr. Rule, if you would like to go ahead, it looks like you have a question.
Well, first of all, I'd like to commend you, Amanda. You have done an absolutely outstanding job in your presentation. You should be very proud of yourself. Just a couple questions. You were making me think as we were going through the presentation, or you were. Do you think there will be more or less generational succession planning in the future? And I'm talking about any industry. I think of my own father, who owned his own business for 3 decades, and there was not a bone in my body that wanted to be any part of that at all. And so I just find it interesting. What would be your educated guess with that?
I'd say based on the research, there is a large focus on individualism in our society and the fact that people do want to kind of, be your own person and not always follow in someone's footsteps. That is something that is encouraged in today's just socially, I think today. However, sometimes through hard times as well, you see people kind of come back to their roots. So I think it also kind of depends on like through the pandemic and stuff, some people did come back to their roots. So you did see a little bit of a fluctuation there. So I think economic times will be kind of one of those key factors in that at least.
So I would like to kind of build on where you ended your presentation and ask your opinion about related to your subjects, because you were talking about opportunities to have more input and more subjects by looking at it nationwide and so forth. I noticed in the data even earlier that the norms and the stories and the family values tended to be positive. And I wonder if you have any opinion about subject bias in this case, especially, and maybe you could take a minute and talk about the steps, because if I'm not mistaken, you got permission with these dealerships through the incumbent. And so I'm wondering if by default there's a subject bias, which then the follow-up to that then is that a weakness to the approach? And if it is, how would you do it in an ideal situation to get around that?
Yeah, so it kind of was dependent. Actually, successor was the primary individual who was able to put the interviews together, or that we asked permission from, because they're the ones that were currently owned, or they were the dealer principal at the time. So essentially, they would have. There was a few times in which they said that there was a few of them that said, "No, I don't want you to come and do this," purely because they didn't want to open up um, maybe some wounds that were still there. They didn't want to reopen and put like pour salt in the wound, so to speak. So I believe that there is a bit of a bias on the ones that did agree to participate, just because they knew they were able to get through this successfully. And that by asking employees these questions, it wasn't going to create chaos in their own business. So yes, was there a bias? I believe there was. How we'd be able to, in the future, if we were to try this again, how we'd be able to get around that. I think that'd be very difficult, just because you have to ask them to agree to participate, unless we can get maybe an anonymous survey, and then part of that anonymous survey, they potentially could be chosen. Maybe we could get around some of the bias there, so that way they're not guaranteeing their spot. But I think knowing how their succession went really kind of made the determination of whether or not they wanted to participate.
Okay, that's fair. Dr. Morrison?
Great job, Amanda. I'm really proud of you. So my question is for you. How do you feel the low number of dealership participants impacted your conclusion?
It definitely impacted, and I think we kind of saw that, especially in the survey responses, that there just wasn't significance, that there just wasn't enough data there. Obviously, I wish we would have been able to get more responses to surveys, and there were a few surveys that, they just didn't really complete the survey, so there wasn't all the data we needed. So I would say that the population was definitely a huge factor, and that probably led to some of our findings, was that everything kind of maintained the same, was because that was what the leadership was hoping to do and hoping to achieve. And that because we just didn't have the numbers in the surveys, that we weren't able to contradict it truly. We weren't really be able to contradict like employee and manager responses versus what the leadership said.
Great. And my second question is, could your same methodology and basic concepts be applied in a situation, say, where a family business was not transitioned to another family member, but instead, like, say, a loyal employee?
I think there definitely could be transition to that because you would use the same conversations. I think you would have a little bit of a different perspective of what the values and the core understanding may differ a little bit just because there was such a focus on family values and what the family thought and what the family history was about. That may differ if you do pick someone who wasn't a part of the family to be a part of, to be the next leadership.
Great. So thank you for your responses. Very good.
So I have one other question, Amanda, and it really is, now that you've done the study, do you feel like the 5 windows framework is the right tool? I mean, if you were to expand this, for example, would that be the tool that you would use now that you've kind of used it this way? And then why either yes or no would be your answer?
I think the 5 windows framework is a great way to get a deeper understanding of the culture. However, I do believe the interviews and the observations and maybe spending more time during the event itself would have made a larger impact on understanding that culture and getting some of those deeper layers that weren't able to be seen by looking at the culture and kind of asking questions to say, hey, can you go back and think about this? Can you go back and talk about this? If maybe, being there and being able to see what that culture was like, that's really what the 5 windows framework was set up for. I think the study could still happen, but you would need a much longer time spent with each of the participants to get that deeper understanding of what the culture really was. So yes, I'd say that the framework could still work for this. Was there, just for the time period, was there a different framework that may have been more useful to look back on? Possibly. But it was really that getting into the deeper layers of the culture that was the focus. And I think it achieved that but we definitely need to spend more time with the individual dealers during the event itself.
Great. Thank you for that. And I agree with my colleagues. Very nice presentation. Very well done. I'd like to open this up now to other questions. We'll start with Dr. Utalma. If you are one of the folks who do not have the video audio opportunity, then please go ahead if you'd like to include a question in the chat. And I will take the opportunity here in a minute to share some of those. So Dr. I?
All right. First, Amanda, I would like to say congratulations for giving a wonderful presentation today. Mine is not really a question. There might be a question in it, but I would like to just give some suggestions for improvement. Would you mind moving all the way back to slide 9, which is your quantitative findings? All right, slide 9, the next one. Yes, right there. So in the second bullet, you have significant variance. I would suggest saying there is a significant difference between the characteristics asked between survey questions, a significant difference. Now, for the third bullet, in statisticians are not, you use the word accepted the null hypothesis. And generally, we are not trying to test. So in hypothesis testing, is generally considered more accurate to say we fail to reject the null hypothesis rather than we accepted the null hypothesis. So I would suggest on the table where you have accepted the null hypothesis, perhaps changing it to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, it might lead to other conversations entirely, because you're not trying to test if the hypothesis is true. You either have sufficient data to reject the null, or insufficient data to you fail to reject the null. So based on the data you have, and you mentioned that you had very low sample size, did you by chance compute the effect size? Because that is not reported in your findings.
No.
So I would maybe suggest that you also have that also included, computing the effect size of and so pretty much trying to suggest that further research with larger sample sizes may be necessary to definitely determine the presence or absence of an effect. So by adding that might have that would make the quantitative part much stronger. So that's my suggestions for improvements.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, anybody else? Dave, Dr. Lyman, yes, please.
So every time we do research, I don't know about always, but there are often surprises. I'd be curious, and you've been through some, and it's hard in this kind of a study, it is hard to get a sample. I get that. Additionally, what other kind of surprises did you have, Amanda?
I think the biggest surprise, just because with being affiliated with Northwood and the automotive community, the conversations I've had with some of the dealers or some of the supporting automotive retailers, just some of the conversations I think I had with them were a little surprising, just because a lot of them do support Northwood and do back Northwood in different situations. And then when it came to this, they were like, "Oh no, we're not even like, we don't want to touch this." So I think that was kind of, it took me back a little bit there. And then also the low response from participants, because when speaking with the dealers, at least in the survey, when speaking with the dealers, they all, spoke really highly of their teams, and they spoke really highly that, "Oh yeah, everyone will definitely participate. I'm sure you'll get great responses." And then the responses just weren't there. So a couple of the dealers their responses were a little bit higher, but they spoke very highly of their team, and then those responses weren't there. Again, not the leadership's fault. This was a completely voluntary study. The participants do not have to do this by any means. So I think I was a little surprised, the leadership's like, "Yeah, of course, like I'll encourage it." And then when it came time to actually doing it, the survey, they just didn't participate. So I think those are kind of like two big surprises. And those are both kind of population based, but those were kind of the ones that really affected the data. So
Do you have any hypotheses why you think that was?
I think we were asking about a possibly sensitive subject. Just like some of the dealers that I had spoke to try to get them to participate. And they're like, we're not going to pour salt in that wound. So I think there was a bit of the fact that this was a bit of a sensitive subject. We were asking about their bosses, and we were asking, honestly, sons about their fathers. It definitely was a subject that candor was something that only some would give, I think. But I think that was probably very difficult for a lot of different people.
I'm going to ask you a totally unfair question at this point.
Go ahead.
So looking on the back end and looking at the sample questions that you've raised, would you have redesigned the study to increase the sample size?
Yeah, I guess the way to increase the sample size with what I was trying to achieve, I picked a specific industry, because when you think of family-owned businesses, I think a lot of people, dealerships are one of those businesses that kind of come to mind.
Okay.
And I think picking that specific industry, was that in my best interest? Initially with the connections Northwood had, of course. Looking back now, should I have focused on an individual community that maybe had more businesses, like a community that had quite a few businesses that had gone into the second and third generations? Could I have adjusted that? Possibly. Maybe looking at something that we knew there were more people who have gone on to multiple generations. However, the longest running dealership in the country for family generations is in Frankenmuth. So I thought, our odds are pretty good. But
Interesting.
no, I possibly the industry portion of it.
Yeah.
And that's why I recommended trying different, maybe trades or something like that, that it's maybe a smaller business, but you do have that passing on through the generations because it's something they learned as they grow up.
So, Amanda, I'm going to ask you one of the questions from the chat. This is from Jeff Hodges. I will come back to Joe Perez's, but Jeff asked, it was asked earlier if you thought the results would be different if the succession wasn't family but a high-level manager. Do you feel the results would be similar depending on the length of time the upper-level manager was employed by the dealer?
There was a large variety of, actually, a couple of them had just completed it. A few of them have been in, had completed it a few years prior. I think the management, how long they've been in management, I think the core value, at least based on the study, the core values, the morals, the ethics were still kind of the focus. But yes, if it was a different manager who wasn't a part of the family, that may have been the one to take over. Would that be significantly different? Possibly. Just because they weren't raised in the family, they don't have to keep going back to the family to answer to the family. I mean, there is a bit of when you are the son or the daughter or someone to take over the business, you do have to respond to your family a little bit. And if you didn't have to do that because you weren't a part of the family, there would be a little bit of a difference of how you understand or how you do things in your management style.
Sounds like another one of those next studies that would be really interesting. So as we're sort of coming to the end of the scheduled time, I really want to ask you, Dr. Perez's question, because it is also a very good sort of concluding question before we go into the deliberation. Dr. Perez says, well done, Amanda. I have to go, but I have a couple of questions. Now that you have completed your research study, what have you learned about yourself as a result of the dissertation experience? And what advice would you give to other Northwood doctoral students currently working on their dissertation? And you have several on the call, so I think that's a great question.
I guess I'll start with what I've learned about myself, I guess. I learned I have a little bit more grit than I thought I did. Because there were moments in this that I looked at my husband and I was like, it's over. I can't keep going. I don't have it in me. Or you just didn't even want to open up that paper anymore just because it was, I don't know, month 5 or 6 and you just spent how many months typing and you're like, I can't do this anymore. I can't look at the same paper. But so I think I had a little more grit in me than I thought I did. I knew I had some there, but there was maybe a little bit more that I kind of reached for. And just like in our book, that is the opening of our program about climbing that mountain, definitely don't give up, because there are moments that you're there, you're there, you don't have any more left in the tank, but just don't give up, because you know what, this feels pretty good. It feels pretty good to be done. I mean, there's still a little bit more to do here and there, but to know that you've been able to complete a study is also something, there's a feeling in there that I think anyone who has their doctorate can understand. There's just an extra little joy to say that I actually did the study. I did it, and I did it by myself, because this is kind of a lonely process, because there's nobody else who understands it like you do, and nobody else has a passion for it like you do. So I'd say don't give up and find something you're passionate about also. Because if you aren't passionate, this is not going to go well.
Right. All right. So one more question from Dr. Fairbairn. If you had to boil your research down to a headline, what would that be? What do you think is the most significant finding that you would make your headline?
Oh goodness. Just one? I'd say that it's on the successor's shoulders to maintain the culture, because I think that it's a concept that you, after you say it, you're like, well, yeah, why wouldn't they be the ones responsible for keeping the culture? But also, it's up to them to communicate that the culture is maintaining, or it's up to them to make those steps, and everyone's looking to them to do whatever they're going to do. And the fact that it truly all the weight during the transition process is on the successor's shoulders. I mean, the incumbent, they're retiring, they're leaving. I mean, there isn't this future they have to continue to build. So I think just the fact that the weight is on the successor's shoulders during this transition period is like that key finding to tell everybody, all these businesses that are going through this. It's like, hey, it's really on, as much as it is on the parent or the father, the parents or the incumbent to pass along the business and make sure they're getting what they want out of it and the value and teaching what they want to teach. And although it is hard to do that change, it is not up to them to keep the business going and all the people that rely on them to keep the business going. It's up to that next generation to kind of the future is theirs and nobody can predict the future. So I think the fact that there's this extra weight on them that maybe hasn't been discussed. There's a lot of discussion about the conflicts or how the incumbent feels or these feelings involved in the transition, but no one talks about the weight of moving forward.
All right. Very good. Well, so thank you, everybody. We are right at the hour, and really, Amanda, great job. And oh, look, you're getting applause. So the next thing that will happen is we're going to wrap up here. And then the committee and I, Scott and Chad, you have a second link to use, and we'll follow up with everybody here shortly. But right now, we need to go chat. So thank you. Have a great evening, and we'll go on to the next step. See you,
Good job,
everybody.
Amanda.
Thank you.